How much of chronic illness is driven by our external environment, by environmental toxicants, maybe pesticides, chemicals, heavy metals, mycotoxins? Would most chronically ill patients even have a chronic condition if we didn't have such high daily exposures to environmental toxicants?
I think it is a very big part of the causation. We're living in a time where there is an unprecedented number of man-made and also indoor chemicals that directly and negatively impact our health. So I think it's a very complex thing because it's so much more than your recent or even in your lifetime's exposure. We're really talking about what is the exposure of your ancestors, from looking at cell biology and especially the epigenetics of chronic disease or chronic health. It seems like at the very least, you are what your grandmother and grandfather got up to in terms of the effects of not just environmental chemical toxicants on the germline cells, and the switching of the gene regions in order to survive the circumstances that they faced, that can be transmitted from very clear studies, at least 4 or 5 generations down the line. So I think it's this incredibly complex, really ecological role that we play in the direct chemical exposures, but then you blend in, again, the unprecedented pace of life that we have, certainly compared to what I sketched out very deliberately in terms of my observation regarding the pace of life in rural South Africa. There's still time. So again, I feel like it's just an extraordinarily complex thing. And it seems like that 20 to 30% of the population, that if you think of how many people, well, currently this is relevant in the long COVID context, it seems like it's about 20, maybe 30% of people that struggles with ongoing symptoms after the COVID. In terms of biotoxin exposure from Dr. Shoemaker's model, it's about 20 to 30% of people that acquire the SIRS or the immune-involved illness from mold and non-recovery afterward. If you look at models with regards to HLA genetics in the context of chronic infections, especially Lyme, it's about 20 to 30% of people that struggle with chronic Lyme after the initial inoculation. So it seems like it's this, just tying this idea together, it's a very complex, your genome in the environment with all the supporting and convoluting factors that play a role. That said, a lot of it is acquired. So with a deliberate eye and a steady hand, you can disacquire the imprint of the environment on your health.
You are definitely a deep thinker. That went even beyond what I was thinking in terms of the environmental toxicity. But having myself learned a lot from Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt over the years, I mean, certainly he talks a lot about the impact of even the Holocaust, World War II, those kinds of things, and how that is an epigenetic influencer of gene expression that certainly contributes to a lot of the conditions that we see today. So we may have to weave in a little bit about, in our discussion later, how do we then deal with or address or mitigate the impact of some of our ancestral traumas and toxicant exposures and stressors and things of that nature. If we think a little bit about the environmental toxicants that we encounter in our current lifetime, what are the ones that might be at the top of the list in terms of not only the health problems they create, the severity of those problems, but even the depth to which they embed themselves into our bodies, into our cells, and thus the difficulty potentially in getting them out of the cell, out of the system? Are we more concerned about mycotoxins or pesticides or chemicals or microplastics or metals or something else? What do you see as the most troubling environmental toxicant exposures?
I think you named most of what I see. And there's really two answers to this question: is what is happening inside the cells, and what are we able to see and test for? So again, rewind 20 years, mercury, toxic metals, that was at the top of the list of toxicants that we focused on. And then we started learning more. Basically, the laboratory support system for our clinicians evolved wonderfully so that now we can do not just urine toxic metals, but we can also test for mycotoxins in urine and also industrial toxins in urine. And that is what a lot of integrated doctors and colleagues focus on, and it's wonderful. But the newest addition to this line of testing is literally the testing of toxins retained inside the cells. And that does look like it is a different cocktail or a different blend of cellular uptake and retention as compared to what the body is able to eliminate and excrete for us to test in the body fluids. So I find that in natural medicine, integrated medicine, we are maybe disproportionately focused on the toxins that we are at the moment, which are plastics, glyphosate, agricultural toxins, but also mycotoxins, which we can now test for in urine and also with some antibody tests. But if you look at what's inside the cells, it's not always the same thing. You've got a different body compartment for it. And I find that exposure is sometimes the same as what we see as retained toxins inside the cells, and excreted toxins that we can assess in urinary toxin measurements is much of the time, but not all the time, different from the type of, for example, mycotoxins that we find inside the cells. So, I think it's a very complex question. I think depending on circumstances and the method of evaluation that you use, you will get different answers. At this stage, I strongly favor the assessment of body burden of toxins, cellular burden of toxins, which in my opinion is where the actual damage happens, with the intracellular testing of toxins.